Fix this car and it's yours. The CEO's words cut through the air with a challenging tone. He smiled, certain that the homeless man standing before him had no clue what he was talking about. Everyone around, in the luxury parking lot, chuckled at what seemed like a cruel joke. How could a man homeless and without resources fix such a sophisticated car? But there was something in the homeless man's gaze, something in his stance, that didn't quite match the stereotype they all expected. Jake had nothing but dirty clothes and a quiet dignity. He wasn't intimidated. Without hesitation, he crouched beside the car, his calloused hands touching the engine. The CEO, already preparing to laugh at the situation, saw something in Jake that he hadn't expected. The homeless man was starting to work on the car's gears with surprising precision. The smile on the CEO's face began to fade, and the engine, which had been silent, made its first sound of life. The crowd around, once relaxed, started to realize this wasn't just a joke. Jake, the man they'd written off, was about to do something that defied all expectations. And the CEO? Well, he didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn a lesson that would make him rethink everything he thought he knew about people like Jake. Before we dive back into this touching story, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Now let's continue the story. It was a morning like any other. The sun beat down fiercely on the parking lot of one of the city's most luxurious companies, reflecting off a sea of expensive, shiny cars. In the center, a towering sports car. The kind of car only a CEO could drive, surrounded by security guards, assistants, and an aura of power. But the real surprise wasn't in the car. It was in the man who, seemingly, had nothing. Jake was a homeless man. His dirty clothes and unshaven face told the story of someone who had been left behind. Perhaps he had a better life once, but today he was just another one of the invisible people on the city's streets. And like every big city, the streets were full of them. People like Jake, without homes, without resources, without a voice. But Jake wasn't like the others. There was something in him that people couldn't see. And that's exactly what happened when he approached the sports car. The CEO, sitting in his position of power, gave a mocking smile and looked at Jake. He was about to get into the car and head to an important meeting. But as he looked at the homeless man, an idea crossed his mind. An idea he thought would be nothing more than a joke. "Fix this car and it's yours," said the CEO, with a smile that reflected more disdain than anything else. The audience around them, made up of executives and employees, chuckled quietly. Everyone thought it was a joke. Everyone believed Jake didn't stand a chance. After all, what could a homeless man know about fixing a luxury car? Jake, however, didn't seem at all unsettled. He knew the world had never given him a fair shot, but that didn't mean he was going to let an opportunity slip by. With a calm movement, he crouched next to the car and began to examine the engine. The CEO and the other observers, still quietly laughing, were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The tension in the air was palpable. The sound of the stalled engine seemed to mock Jake, daring him to try. The CEO, confident in his judgment, started to step away, his smile widening. He was sure the homeless man wouldn't be able to do anything but make things worse. After all, he had no formal education in mechanics. He had nothing but his calloused hands and his life experiences. But Jake had something the CEO couldn't see. He had a story. He had been a mechanic before everything. Life had taken him down tough paths, but his skills had never been erased. He knew what he was doing. With steady hands, he began to work on the car's gears, and soon the sound of the key turning echoed through the air. The CEO, now stepping back, stopped and looked over his shoulder. Something was wrong. The engine made a noise. It wasn't the expected sound of failure, but rather the sound of an engine being brought back to life. The audience, which had been laughing moments before, began to fall silent, and slowly the smile on the CEO's face faded, replaced by an expression of surprise. The machine, which he thought was beyond repair, was starting to come alive. Jake, the man he had mocked, was doing the impossible. The sound of the engine grew louder, more confident, and suddenly, the engine roared. It was the sound no one expected to hear, the sound of a turning point, the sound of humiliation for a man who thought he knew everything. The CEO didn't know what to do. He stood there, unable to control the situation. The homeless man was no longer a joke. He was living proof that appearances are deceiving, and more importantly, he was about to show that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected places. The crowd began to gather around, their faces now filled with curiosity. They were witnessing something that, for many of them, seemed impossible. They were witnessing a transformation. The engine was running, and with it, Jake was about to gain more than just a car. He was about to gain a lesson about life, about who he really was, and about the power of not letting circumstances define you. The CEO, still trying to regain his composure, didn't know what to do. He was being challenged, confronted by something he never imagined he would see. He never imagined that a homeless man could be so capable. He never imagined that someone with nothing could have so much to offer. And there, in that luxury parking lot, amidst the shiny cars and people with seemingly perfect lives, the real challenge was just beginning. The CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the country wasn't just the type of man who wore a suit and tie as a shield, but also the kind of man who believed money could buy everything. His name was Richard Thorne, and his world revolved around numbers, contracts, and quick decisions that kept him at the top of the corporate food chain. To him, people were just pieces in a game where victory meant power, and power in turn meant control. Richard was used to being the central figure wherever he went. He was the businessman everyone wanted to be, but no one dared challenge. In his meetings, he spoke with authority, and his word carried the weight of a sentence. His world was full of people who bowed to him, who sought his applause and awaited his approval. Arrogance was a trait he wasn't ashamed to display. He was a man who believed that success was determined by the ability to keep everything under control. But Richard had a flaw, something he never imagined he would realize. He saw people in a superficial way, as if they were defined by their appearance or the amount of money in their bank accounts. He never bothered to look deeper, to realize that behind every face, there was a story. To him, the stories of people living on the streets were irrelevant, mere statistics that didn't apply to his world of wealth and privilege. When Jake approached, he was just another faceless person he occasionally saw on the streets. Looking at Jake, Richard felt a wave of superiority. He looked at the homeless man, with his dirty clothes and unshaven face, and immediately concluded there was nothing more than an insignificant being there. To Richard, a man like Jake wasn't worth even the price of a coffee in the cafe of his building. He was immune to the stories, the challenges, and the dreams of those living on the margins of society. He was the CEO. He was the measure of all things. However, what Richard didn't know was that behind that appearance of abandonment, Jake had something money couldn't buy, something the CEO had never known how to cultivate, a story of resilience and an innate skill he had acquired throughout his life. And more importantly, Jake had something Richard had never known how to deal with: dignity. Jake had never been a famous person. He'd never been on any magazine covers or at the top of any celebrity lists. In fact, Jake was the exact opposite of everything Richard represented. He was a simple man, but complex. His story wasn't made of contracts and negotiations, but of daily struggles, sleepless nights, tough choices, and a life full of unexpected challenges. He didn't have a home, but that didn't mean he didn't have a place in the world. He didn't have money, but that didn't make him any less valuable. Jake's life wasn't marked by luxury, but by his constant search for something more, something he knew was inside him, but that society often ignored: the ability to start over, to reinvent himself. And deep down, Jake knew that while appearances defined him as a man on the margins, he possessed something far more valuable than what others could see. He had skills he had acquired when he was a mechanic, still young, before life's winds carried him down a path he didn't choose, but one he accepted. Now, those skills were about to be put to the test. What many didn't know, and what Jake rarely spoke of, was that he had worked in a mechanic shop before his life was devastated by job loss and lack of opportunities. Like many men, he was swallowed by the system, thrown onto the streets by something he had no control over. But unlike many, he didn't give up. He didn't let despair consume him. He adapted. He learned to survive with the little he had, but he never lost his passion for what he knew how to do best. And when Richard issued his challenge, Jake didn't see it as just a chance to fix a luxury car. He saw the opportunity to prove that his dignity was not for sale. Jake had eyes that saw the world differently. He saw what others didn't see. He understood the value of every piece of metal, every part that fit precisely, as if everything had a purpose, as if even the greatest adversities in life could be fixed with patience, skill, and will. He wasn't just a homeless man. He was a man with a vast knowledge of how the world worked, or at least how to make things work when everything around him was broken. And now, he was about to prove that to Richard. Not just that he could fix the car, but that a person's true strength wasn't in their appearance or external circumstances. A person's true strength was within themselves. As Richard watched Jake, unaware, a transformation was happening. He didn't know that the lesson he needed to learn was about to be delivered by a man who, in the eyes of the world, was worth nothing. But Jake knew. He knew that while Richard relied on his power and wealth, he relied on something far more enduring: the ability to start over, to persist, to never give up. And with that, he was about to show the CEO and the world that true greatness was not measured by the bank balance but by the character and actions of each individual. The parking lot was filled with a tense silence, a cold breeze cutting through the air as if the environment itself knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. Richard Thorne, the CEO of one of the largest companies in the country, stood beside his car, a rare and coveted model, his posture flawless as always. He wore an arrogant smile, reflecting the unshakable confidence he had in his control over the world. He knew he was in control. He always was. In front of him, a dirty man with disheveled hair and worn-out clothes was kneeling beside the car, his eyes focused on the engine. It was as if they were in two completely different worlds, worlds that would never cross. Richard looked at Jake, the homeless man, and his mind immediately assessed the situation. He saw him as a walking joke, someone who had nothing more to offer than his unwanted presence. Jake's life, so visible in the dirt on his clothes and the scars on his face, was a perfect reflection of his insignificance in Richard's eyes. Then, the idea struck him. A test, a challenge, a way to reaffirm his power and prove once again just how much he was above everyone and everything around him. With a malicious smile, he approached Jake, his voice dripping with irony, and said, "Fix this car, and it's yours." The crowd surrounding the parking lot watching the scene reacted immediately. Some chuckled softly, others exchanged skeptical glances, but everyone was more or less on the same level of disbelief. What would a homeless man know about fixing such a sophisticated car? The joke was obvious. The CEO was giving him an impossible task, something that would only reinforce the idea that people like Jake had no value. Jake didn't move. He didn't look at Richard, nor at the others who were now all watching the situation. He simply took a deep breath and knelt beside the car's engine, his gaze fixed on the details of the motor, as if he had been transported to another place, a place where Richard's wealth and power had no influence. He didn't care what others thought. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there because he knew he had a skill that, until that moment, no one had recognized. Richard watched, still wearing a smile on his face. He thought this would be just another way to humiliate Jake once again. A homeless man couldn't fix a luxury car. It was an unquestionable piece of evidence that, in the grand game of life, he would never have a chance. He was so certain of his own superiority that he didn't even consider the possibility that Jake might do something other than fail. Meanwhile, Jake began to work. His hands, calloused from time on the streets and the hard labor he had done before losing everything, started moving with precision. He didn't need instructions or sophisticated tools. His knowledge, gained over years working in a mechanic shop, was enough. He knew how to work the gears, the parts, the sections of the engine that everyone considered irreparable. With careful movement, Jake removed the engine cover and began checking the connections. His fingers moved with a confidence Richard could never have imagined. The CEO, watching from a distance, felt an odd sense of discomfort. He was starting to realize that something was happening that he hadn't anticipated. Jake, the man he had underestimated, was beginning to show signs that he knew exactly what he was doing. As Jake worked on the engine, Richard moved a little closer, still with the intention of ridiculing him. He crossed his arms and watched, waiting for the moment when Jake would fail, and the situation would return to normal, where he would remain the man of power and control. The sound of the engine, which had been completely dead, began to emit noises. It wasn't the sound of a broken engine, but the sound of something starting to work, something moving again. Richard furrowed his brow. This wasn't right. He looked at the others present, trying to find some sign that this was just an illusion, but the surprised expressions of those around him indicated otherwise. Jake didn't stop. He was completely focused on what he was doing. His hands were dirty, but his movements were precise, calculated. With every passing second, the tension grew. The CEO, who had been smiling with disdain, began to realize that he was approaching something he couldn't control. He could no longer rely on the power of his position, the money that ensured his dominance. What Jake was doing with so little was challenging everything he believed to be true about the world. The audience, who had been watching in silence, now began to murmur. They could see that something was happening. Something that, until that moment, seemed impossible. Jake was breaking the barriers of expectation. He wasn't the homeless man everyone thought he was. He was someone much more complex, much more skilled than anyone could imagine. The engine began to show signs of life. First, a faint roar. Then a stronger, more consistent sound. It was no longer a broken engine, but something that was about to work again. Jake, with a serious and focused expression, turned to Richard, not saying a word. He didn't need to. What was happening already spoke for itself. Richard Thorne was completely taken aback. He didn't know what to think. He, who had always controlled everything with his wealth and status, was now faced with something he couldn't control. Something that challenged him in a way he had never imagined. The car was starting to work, and with it, Jake was beginning to gain something Richard had never predicted: respect. The engine roared louder. It was no longer a disconnected sound, but one that indicated something more, something that, until that moment, no one had expected. The spectators, who had been bewildered until then, began to move closer. CEO Richard Thorne remained still, his gaze fixed on the car, as if he didn't want to believe what was happening. He, who had always been in control of every situation, was now being confronted with something he couldn't dominate. Jake, for his part, was completely absorbed in his work. His movements were quick, but precise. He didn't care about the crowd around him or the growing pressure coming from Richard and the others, all watching with curious eyes. He knew what he was doing. He knew this moment, this challenge, was the chance he needed to show that, despite all the adversities he had faced, he still had something valuable to offer. As Richard watched, his smug smile slowly faded, replaced by an expression of doubt. He looked at the car, then at Jake, and back at the car. He couldn't understand what was happening. How could the man he had deemed insignificant be doing this? How could the man he thought had nothing be so skilled? The car's engine continued to grow in intensity, until, finally, it made a sound that indicated something was about to happen. It wasn't an error or an accident, it was a beginning, something that Jake had made work. Richard tried to mask the growing discomfort. He had thrown out that challenge as a way to mock Jake, an opportunity to prove that his position was unquestionable. But now, he felt something he didn't know how to control. The first doubt in his mind was followed by a second, and then a third. He wondered, is he really going to make it? The truth was that Richard could no longer be sure of anything. The audience around was silent. The voices that had once laughed and mocked were gone. No one dared to make a comment or laugh at Jake anymore. What was happening there in that small corner of the parking lot was something no one had predicted. The homeless man, who was supposed to be the target of the joke, was starting to take the scene, and this inevitably began to change people's perceptions of him. Jake was no longer part of the crowd of the downtrodden that people ignored on the streets. He was becoming something more. He was demonstrating his true strength, his true skill, something only he knew he had. And as the car's engine came to life, a small part of his dignity, the dignity that had been stolen by so many hardships, was being restored. It was as if each movement he made was giving him back a little of what life had taken from him. And with every rotation of that engine, every sound of success, the audience around began to see Jake in a different light. Richard, watching this unfold, felt a rising frustration. He had lived his life believing that money and power were the only things that truly mattered. He believed that with money, he could shape the world to his liking. He believed everything and everyone had a price. But what he didn't know was that Jake, the man he had scorned, wasn't for sale. Jake wasn't there to prove anything to Richard. He was there to prove something to himself. The challenge, which at first seemed to be just a form of amusement for Richard, was now becoming something more. The CEO was starting to realize that no matter how hard he tried, he didn't have total control over the situation. He couldn't simply command Jake like he did with his employees, his subordinates. Jake was no longer a passive figure. He was no longer in a place where Richard could dictate his worth. Jake was acting on his own, and that changed everything. The tension was rising with every second. The engine, now running almost perfectly, caused the crowd to get even closer. Some whispered among themselves while others stood in silence, watching every movement Jake made with growing attention. What had once seemed like a game of disdain was now transforming into a silent battle, where Jake's skills were his only weapon, his only defense. Richard, realizing that time was running out, tried to step forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. He looked at Jake and for a moment thought about interrupting everything, giving him the car and moving on without any further delay. But before he could do anything, the engine let out one last powerful roar. The sound was clear and defined, as if the car, by its own will, had decided to come to life. At that moment, everyone around knew that the impossible had happened. The homeless man, the one no one believed in, had done what seemed impossible. The car was working. The engine was alive. And with that, Jake's story was about to change forever. But the real question now wasn't the car. It was what Richard would do with this. The sound of the engine now filled the space with an unexpected force. It was a sound of resurrection, from an engine that had once been still and was now coming to life. Jake, with a subtle and determined smile on his face, took a step back and observed what he had done. The engine wasn't just working, it was roaring, with the confidence of a car that had never known what failure was. What seemed impossible to all the observers around was happening right before their eyes. Richard Thorne, the CEO who had issued the challenge with an arrogance that only power and money could provide, was beginning to lose control of the situation. The smile that had once formed on his face was now replaced by an expression of growing discomfort. He looked at the engine, then at Jake, and then at the crowd around them, who were now watching in silence. What was supposed to be a simple joke, an act of mockery toward a man he considered inferior, was transforming into something much more unsettling. Jake, however, didn't seem interested in the reactions around him. He wasn't there to please, to impress, or to show anything to anyone. His focus was on the car, on the sound, the feel, the rhythm of the engine. To him, it was like music. Every movement he made with his hands was with the precision of a musician tuning an instrument. He felt the car, he knew what it needed, and with every move, he was getting closer to the goal that no one had believed was possible. Meanwhile, Richard watched from a distance, trying to understand what was happening. He knew Jake didn't have the tools of a professional mechanic. There wasn't a luxury studio around, nor high-end equipment. But what Jake was doing with the simple tools he had in his hands was more than enough. The engine, which had once been dead, was now running as if it were prepared to conquer the road. The audience, initially skeptical, was now completely absorbed in what was happening. Some began to move closer, almost as if they were witnessing a miracle. Richard's initial contempt for Jake was giving way to a growing doubt, and his posture, which had once been imposing and dominant, now seemed more fragile, more vulnerable. Jake, with a skill that seemed innate, adjusted another piece of the engine. He touched the gears with a gentleness that contrasted with the roughness of his appearance. His hands, calloused by life's hardships, moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't the skill of a mechanic using sophisticated tools in a luxurious environment. It was the skill of a man who had lived, who had learned to use whatever was at his disposal. And Jake knew that, in that moment, he didn't need anything more. As Richard tried to process what was happening, the engine made a deep sound, a strong and continuous roar. The car wasn't just working, it was showing the potential that many would never have believed it had. Jake moved slightly away, observing the engine now with a look of satisfaction. He didn't need to worry about what others thought of him. He knew he had done the right thing. He knew he had succeeded. But Richard's discomfort only grew. He moved away from the car, his gaze fixed on the engine, trying to understand what was happening. What had seemed like a simple power play, a way to humiliate Jake, was now challenging him in a way he had never imagined. Richard tried to understand what had failed in his judgment. How could a homeless man, someone he saw as inferior, do something he himself, with all his power and wealth, had failed to foresee? The CEO found himself trapped in his own arrogance. He didn't know how to react. He had control in his corporate life, but here, in front of Jake, he was starting to realize that control meant nothing. What Jake was showing as he worked on that engine with such skill was that true strength wasn't in what the world saw, but in what couldn't be seen at first glance. Richard had made a judgment based only on appearances, but Jake was showing that appearances weren't everything. As the engine continued to roar, Jake remained silent. He knew that words weren't necessary. What he was doing spoke for itself. He was changing the narrative, breaking the prejudices that had been imposed on him. He was proving in a quiet way that a person's worth isn't determined by their appearance or social status. The crowd was now completely silent. The tension in the air was palpable. The CEO, who had once felt secure, was now starting to feel uncomfortable in his own skin. He had underestimated Jake, had ignored the story and the skills that this man possessed, and now the challenge he himself had set was turning against him. The car was working and Jake was winning, not only the respect of everyone around him but something far more important, his own affirmation. The crowd was getting closer, and some were already beginning to silently applaud, as if they were recognizing the incredible turnaround happening right before them. Richard, still in shock, looked around, but no one seemed more interested in him. The center of attention was now on Jake, and with that, the lesson Richard would never forget began to unfold. The car's engine continued to roar with an increasing growl, now firm and constant, as if the machine itself were adapting to Jake's presence. The spectators, who had initially been watching with curiosity, were now completely immersed in the scene. The whispers began to intensify, and many could no longer hide their fascination. What had once seemed like a simple trick or Jake's failed attempt to prove something was transforming into something that no one could deny. The homeless man was mastering this. Richard, on the other hand, felt increasingly out of place. He stepped back slightly from the car, his face growing more tense. He had never felt this sense of powerlessness before. He was the CEO. He commanded meetings, imposed his authority, and everyone bowed before him. But here, in front of Jake, he had no control. He didn't know how to react. How could he continue believing in his own superiority when reality stood right before him, challenging all of his perceptions? The engine was running, and Jake was at the center of it all, becoming more than ever the figure of respect Richard had never imagined could exist. The crowd around them was silent, their gazes fixed on the car and Jake. The sound of the engine filled the air, blending with Richard's deep breaths. Every second felt like an eternity. What had started as a simple amusement, a small test to maintain control, was now transforming into a battle of egos, skills, and unexpected lessons. Jake, calmly, adjusted another piece of the engine. He was in his element. There was something extraordinary in the way he moved, as if he knew exactly what each action would do. It wasn't just his calloused fingers touching the metal with precision. It was a feeling he carried within him, a quiet confidence that came from years of experience. Jake didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He knew what he was doing. And what the CEO didn't realize was that this was the only place where Jake truly belonged. In control. Not of power or wealth, but of what he knew how to do best. Richard, for his part, was becoming more and more unsettled. He took a step back, trying to regain control of the situation. But there was no going back now. He tried to convince himself that it was all just luck. A coincidence. Maybe the engine had some defect that Jake had managed to fix temporarily. But with each roar of the engine, his faith in the simplest explanation dwindled. He looked at the others around him, who were now starting to move, some with expressions of admiration, others still with surprised looks. The silence broke here and there with small murmurs and quick glances between the onlookers, as if everyone were trying to understand what was happening. The turnaround was happening right before Richard's eyes, and he couldn't do anything. The man he had thought was inferior was now at the center of the scene, and the pieces of the engine, like puzzle pieces, were fitting perfectly. It wasn't just Jake's skill that was at stake, it was his entire worldview. Richard had become accustomed to seeing the world simply. Those with money and power ruled. But Jake was deconstructing that concept piece by piece. He was proving that, in a society where everyone is judged by their possessions or appearance, a person's worth wasn't in their bank account, but in what they knew how to do and how they rose above adversity. As the engine finally gave one last breath of life, Jake stepped back slightly, observing with a satisfied but serene look. He didn't smile, didn't make any gestures of victory. He simply stood there, looking at the car that was now functioning as it should, as if that were just another step in his journey. He wasn't concerned with the applause that might come or with the reaction of others. He didn't need external validation. He knew he had done what was right. Richard, however, was trapped in his own frustration. He moved closer to the car, almost as if he wanted to see the evidence of his defeat with his own eyes. The car was perfect now, running as if it had been serviced by a professional mechanic. He looked at Jake, who was now standing in front of him, without a word more. He felt a rising heat on his face, a mix of anger and humiliation. He wanted to shout, to challenge, to offer an explanation that made sense, but there were no more explanations. Reality stood there, raw and unfiltered, and Jake, with his calloused hands and indomitable spirit, had won. The people around them were now murmuring, some clapping, others still in shock. The challenge Richard had thrown out as a form of mockery had transformed into a moment of revelation for everyone. Jake, the man no one expected anything from, had done the impossible. He had restored not just an engine but his own dignity, and in doing so, he brought the most important lesson Richard had never imagined learning. A person's value can't be measured by appearance, nor by wealth or status. The value is in the actions, in what one does with what they have, and in the ability to rise when everything seems lost. Richard was now standing, his mouth dry and eyes fixed on the engine. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to think. Jake's victory wasn't just in the car that was now working. Jake's victory was in the lesson he had taught the world. A lesson that, for Richard, would be hard to forget. The sound of the engine was now perfect. The car, which had previously been still and silent, was now roaring like a free animal, ready to race down the road. Jake's victory wasn't just in the fact that he had fixed the engine. His victory was in something deeper, something that Richard, the CEO, was now beginning to perceive with a growing shock. The challenge he had thrown out as a joke, as a way to mock Jake, had transformed into a lesson of humility that he would never forget. Jake, calm and confident, stepped away from the car. He didn't care about the applause, the curious glances, or the attention that was now directed at him. He knew that his victory wasn't in the car, but in the fact that he had proved something much greater. He had proven to himself that his dignity couldn't be taken away, that his skills weren't defined by his social status, and that he was more than the appearance the world saw. Richard, on the other hand, stood frozen, trying to process everything that had happened. The man he had despised, the one he saw as nothing more than an inconvenience, was now standing before him, with the engine running perfectly, the car functioning as it should. Richard, with all his wealth and power, could do nothing more than stand in silence, defeated. The crowd around them, once skeptical and even mocking, was now completely silent. Some were still in shock. Others murmured among themselves, trying to understand how something so improbable could have happened. They had seen the impossible happen. Jake, the homeless man, had done what no one imagined would be possible. He had restored not only a car but his own dignity, and in doing so, he brought the most important lesson Richard had never imagined learning. A person's worth isn't measured by their appearance nor by wealth or status. The value is in the actions, in what one does with what they have, and in the ability to rise when everything seems lost. Richard took a step forward, his face red with frustration, but he no longer knew what to say. He looked at Jake but couldn't articulate a single word. What would he do now? How could he continue with his air of superiority when a man he had despised, whom he had seen as inferior, was there standing tall with his head held high and his heart calm? Jake, for his part, said nothing. He didn't need to. He didn't have anything left to prove. His victory was in his own actions. He knew that the car was working because he had put his hands on it and worked with what he knew. It wasn't the power of a rich man that moved the car, but the skill, patience, and perseverance of someone who never gave up, even when the world didn't believe in him. Richard finally stepped away. He walked to the side, his expression of discomfort now replaced with a dark quietness. He knew that this day would be one he would never forget. He knew he would never look at anyone the same way again, because what Jake had done wasn't just fixing a car. What Jake had done was show that, in the end, it wasn't possessions that define a person, but their actions, their abilities, and above all, their dignity. The spectators began to disperse, some still talking among themselves, others still trying to process what they had just witnessed. But there was something in the air, something that changed that moment for everyone. They weren't just watching a homeless man fix a car. They were watching a human being reclaim his dignity. They were seeing what happens when someone who has been devalued by society rises, defies expectations, and proves their worth with what really matters. Jake, with a calm look, turned to those around him. He wasn't waiting for thanks or recognition. He had done what he knew how to do best. The real victory for him wasn't in the attention he was receiving, but in the knowledge that he had proven something important. He had shown himself that his dignity was never in question, and that his ability, what he knew how to do, was undeniable, no matter where he was. Richard, now distant from the crowd, looked at the car, but no longer saw the same thing. What had once been a simple luxury machine, an extension of his wealth and power, was now imbued with a new truth. He looked at Jake one last time and, in a way, felt he was standing before something greater than anything money could buy. He felt a growing discomfort, not just with what had happened, but with the lesson he had just learned. True power, the true strength of a person, wasn't found in wealth or appearance. It was in the actions, in the ability to rise, to rebuild when life seems to have taken everything from you. The car was now perfect. The engine roared once again as if greeting Jake's victory. But deep down, everyone knew that Jake's true victory wasn't in the car. It was in the ability to transform something that seemed useless into something useful, to challenge the expectations of a world that didn't believe in him. And in the end, as the crowd began to disperse, the lesson became clear. The true greatness of a person isn't measured by their possessions or social position. True greatness lies in the ability to overcome difficulties, to rise again, and most importantly, to never lose one's dignity. And in that moment, Jake had achieved something Richard would never reach: the respect of himself. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next ones. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the choices made by the characters? Do you agree with how things unfolded, or would you have done something different? Drop your opinion in the comments below.